This is I'm Stuck, and in our second video of the Cold War series, we will be looking at the Yalta Conference, which was held from the 4th of February 1945 to the 11th of February 1945. So the Yalta Conference took place as the war started to come to a close. So this happened when the war was still going on. However, it was fairly certain that the Allies were going to win this. The Germans were short of troops, they had been defeated, they had made some silly decisions like invading Stalingrad, and it was at this point, it was about the Allies deciding their future on being victorious. So the three powers, these were the big powers of Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, Stalin of Soviet Union, and Roosevelt, the President of America, met at the Crimean city of Yalta, and this was to decide the future of the post-war world. It was also meant to show the solidarity of a grand alliance, which in truth wasn't really very solid. It was the only reason that there was this whole grand alliance was because everyone had this common enemy of Germany. Once Germany were out of the picture, it meant that there were really the underlying tensions started to come, and they were starting to fight against each other rather than work together. So this would be shown in the objectives of the big three. And Roosevelt and Churchill did have similar objectives, partly because both of them were capitalists. So they wanted a collective security founded in the UN, in which the Soviet Union would play a part. They also wanted the right to national self-determination, with no spheres of influence. So self-determination is countries being able to choose who they are run by, and spheres of influence were basically what Russia wanted, and we'll talk about that a bit later. They wanted Germany's reconstruction as a democratic nation, and Roosevelt wanted the Soviets to aid them in their attack against Japan. So although the attack against Germany, the war against Germany finished, the war against Japan hadn't finished until later, when US dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So Stalin had these different objectives, and he wanted to improve the USSR security by spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. And this is a main policy for him, as he wanted to protect himself. He wanted to protect the Soviet Union by creating this so-called buffer zone, and we will talk about this a lot more in future videos. He wanted Germany to remain weak for the indefinite future so that they couldn't attack again, and he wanted to also preserve the role of the Lublin government within Poland. Again, the Poland is a big talking point, and we'll talk about this when we talk more about Stalin and his actions in Eastern Europe in a future video. So the effects of the Yalta Conference were vast. So Germany was a big talking point in the Yalta Conference, and it was decided that it would be divided into 4 sections. Now, these 4 sections would each be controlled by one of the powers, and that's USA, Britain, France, and the USSR. Now, Berlin, likewise, would also be divided into these 4 sections. Furthermore, other effects of the Yalta Conference was that the United Nations would be set up. The USSR would also gain land from Poland, and Poland would also be expanded into the north and the west, so that was taking land from Germany. And Stalin agreed to allow free elections in Europe and enter the Asian War against Japan in exchange for the return of lands in which he lost in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. Now, you'll learn soon that in future the Allies, both Roosevelt and Churchill, didn't really want Stalin to take part in this Japanese war, as they believed that he might become greedy and start wanting to take more land. In 1944, Churchill had signed an agreement, or talked about an agreement with Stalin, and that's called the Percentages Agreement, which meant that different countries would have different amount of influence over the countries in Eastern Europe. For example, in Romania, Stalin was to have 90% of the influence, whereas Britain was only have 10%, whereas in Greece, Britain would have 90%, and Stalin was only have 10%. So this meant that Stalin thought that this percentage agreement entitled himself to create a sphere of influence all over Eastern Europe. And this meant that he broke his promises of free elections and installed governments which were dominated from the Soviet Union. Now, he managed to install these governments for manipulation of elections, and he killed non-prominent governments or those who were capitalists. Now, the Yalta Conference effectively split Europe into two zones as well, and the West was under a US sphere of influence, while the East lay under a Soviet sphere of influence. Now, this meant that both Roosevelt and Churchill were criticised in effectively selling out the Eastern European nations to the rule of Soviet Union. However, it is argued as well that the Soviets were in a very strong position, because after the war they had taken a lot of land. They were in a good position of land, whereas Britain had just got into Germany at this point. So it meant that Churchill and Roosevelt were unable to really negotiate a deal in which the Soviets were not given a majority of their aims. So now we're going to talk more about the different leaders of Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, and what were their aims. Now, Stalin was desperate to build up the security of the Soviet Union because they had lost 25 million men and masses of land, agriculture, industry. So his main thing was to protect and build up the Soviet Union. So Stalin and his foreign minister called Molotov viewed the Grand Alliance as fundamentally anti-communist. So he wanted to keep, but he did want to keep a vague sense of cooperation because it would be practical for them. His other main priorities included ensuring that the Eastern Europe lay within a Soviet sphere of influence, and he wanted to turn Germany into a fully communist state in the future. Now, this meant that at the moment it had to be kept weak, as we've talked about before. Roosevelt has been criticised for his elements of naivety with Stalin. However, you have to remember at this point Roosevelt was extremely ill at the Yalta Conference, and he later did die before the Potsdam Conference. And he strongly believed in the setup of an international peacekeeping organisation of the UN, which was later set up. And he also showed commitment to cooperate with the Soviet Union because he did not want the Grand Alliance to break up. So he did allow the Soviet Union a lot of things because he didn't want them to break up. He also believed that post-war should represent the democratic views in which the US possessed, and was certain that he could secure non-communist futures for the states of Eastern Europe. In reality, that did not happen at all. All of Eastern Europe pretty much turned under Stalin's influence, apart from a couple of exceptions, which we'll talk about in future videos. Now, Churchill mistrusted Stalin, as he was convinced that Stalin wanted to expand Soviet power into the whole of Europe. In reality, he was correct. This meant that he was desperate to form a close alliance with the US as a way to fight against the threat that the USSR had on Britain's colonial interests. Now, obviously, Britain at this time had a lot of colonial powers abroad. In the future, throughout the Cold War, they don't have many colonial powers. Big powers such as India start to become independent, and this means that Britain are no longer a superpower. So they really needed USA as a great ally because they are the superpower they need. Now, Churchill also wanted to protect the British interests in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So this is the reason why he suggested that a percentage agreement with Stalin in order to control the Soviet expansion and the sphere of influence which it had. So we've already talked about the percentages agreement, but this was just to establish the influence, so Churchill himself could protect his interest in Eastern Europe, as well as Stalin getting kind of what he wanted. So after Yalta, there were significantly deteriorating relationships. And the main cause for this was how a liberated Europe was to be implied. Now, obviously, one of the main effects of the thing was that Europe would be liberated, but one of the main problems was Poland. And during the war, a Polish government was in exile in London, and the USSR supported the setup of a pro-communist government in Lublin. Now, this was something that they had planned in advance because they planned it for when the war ended. Now, this government, this non-communist government, returned to Poland. However, they were eliminated, so they could not be set up, and Stalin regained and kept this communist government, which was set up in Poland. So Roosevelt disagreed with it, and he believed that whilst the Lublin government could play a part, a new government should still get up. And this really was a fundamental relationship problem between the two countries. So thank you for watching this video. Next video we'll be looking at the Potsdam Conference, another conference between the three countries, and the final conference before the Cold War really kicked off and there were many wars and many problems. So thank you for watching, and see you soon. Bye.